Well, North Korea says that it is ready to halt its nuclear program and missile tests in exchange for food aid from the United States. It may be one less nuclear threat to worry about for now, but here in Washington, all the attention seems to be focused on Iran's alleged quest for the atomic bomb. Now, the Islamic Republic insists that its nuclear program is essentially peaceful. Earlier today, the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, said that holding nuclear weapons is a sin. Of course, that's not likely to quiet the drums of war. Israel has threatened to launch a preemptive strike against Tehran's nuclear facilities, a position that seems to have wide support here in the U.S. Congress. And it's also an issue that's likely to dominate the agenda next week in Washington, when the Israeli Prime Minister is scheduled to meet with President Obama, right after AIPAC, the powerful pro-Israel lobby, holds its annual policy conference. And it does seem that public opinion is echoing Washington, too. A recent Pew survey found that a majority of Americans would support a strike against Iran if sanctions failed. They also named the Islamic Republic as U.S. enemy #1. However, that is not a view shared by my next guest. 27-year-old Sean Stone is the son of director Oliver Stone, and he made headlines recently over reports that he's converted to Islam. He was in the country earlier this month and joins me now to explain why. Sean, thank you so much for being here on the program. Now, you've been getting a lot of criticism for all this, and considering the rhetoric coming out of Washington, some would say you're essentially palling around with the enemy. What's your motivation here?
Well, I would ask, in terms of the polls that American people are being asked about attacking Iran preemptively, or as we did with Iraq, I would say if that was just as easy as attacking Iran, that's one thing. What if that leads to World War III? Are you still so sure that you want to do this? And this is my ultimate point, is to prevent or stop what I think is we are walking into World War III at the moment, between Syria being destabilized and Iran on its border being threatened by Israel and America. To me, we're in a very dangerous time, and we don't recognize what the consequences will be not only regionally, but to the world, because Russia has stated that they do not want to see the overthrow of the Syrian regime or the Iranian regime, because these are countries in its backyard and basically on its border across the Caspian Sea. So we're in a very dangerous geopolitical situation. Having studied this historically, I recognize the great game that is being played out between British imperial factions using America against the Russians. And American people just don't have this background or knowledge to recognize what's at stake here.
And the thing is, though, we're talking about background and knowledge and what's at stake here, but the rhetoric that's coming out from our own politicians that we as Americans are elected into office does not seem to support what you're saying. It seems to support the idea that Iran is a giant threat. How do you account for that?
Well, I account for it from the fact that we have no diplomacy engaging with these people. In America, we don't really understand that, for example, the president, Ahmadinejad, who I'm being alleged as being a defendant of his. I'm not trying to defend him. He's not on trial, but he's not the military commander of that country. I mean, he has to basically answer to the Supreme Leader, to his parliament. He cannot single-handedly pull a nuke. The fact, to my mind, is this. What's happening is we are now in a state of martial law and war globally. I was told back in December by a very close friend of mine who knows a former presidential candidate. I won't disclose who that is. This candidate's office told my friend by March of this year he should consider leaving the country. And I didn't understand. I understood why, because of the NDAA, but I didn't realize that NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, actually comes into effect tomorrow. Now, this act that Obama has called for and signed stipulates that even American citizens can now be targeted by the military, picked up, and imprisoned indefinitely without civilian trial, thus throwing out our due process, our habeas corpus clauses. So we are now in the state of martial law as of tomorrow, and obviously, if you're counting now the use of drones on U.S. soil, the fact that our president has assassinated American citizens, everything is now putting conditions for a total war state. I mean, McCain called for the whole America becoming part of the so-called battlefield. America is now a battlefield. The whole earth is a battlefield. So rather than trying, I'm worried that what's being done is that rather than trying to address our continued economic depression and the reforms necessary domestically, what we're trying to do then is create a martial law state, using Iran as the terrorist enemy or threat, and even making these claims that Iran is ready to use terrorism abroad. You have instances like the Iranian in Thailand who blows himself up. This could be a false flag instigation done by a different country to make Iran look like a terrorist. So you see, everything is now in motion as a pretext that you can go in martial law here and war abroad. And obviously the war abroad has tremendous consequences, not only because if you attack Iran, Hezbollah and Hamas can unleash on Israel, which then brings America and potentially Russia into the equation. So this is we're in a horrible situation, and people are not being educated as to what's really going on.
And Sean, if that is indeed the case, then who would profit from that kind of push towards martial law, push towards war? Who would benefit from that?
I mean, to my calculation, what you're dealing with is an economy, the Wall Street economy, that has not really recovered from from their overall deficits, maybe not deficit, their overall debt. I mean, they basically have derivatives that are still unaccounted for. They ultimately can't really, get things going. And Obama's, continuous bailout of Wall Street and Europe as well, by the way, is not actually helping the common working people. So if you go towards an austerity program, for example, I mean, you could ultimately lead to fascism in this country and in Western Europe.
And do you think we're trending towards is America trending towards fascism? Do you think that that's the trend right now?
Well, in terms of abrogating our Constitution, that's already in place. I mean, the fact that no one is having is creating a stir or an outcry about this, the idea that U.S. citizens can be picked up by and detained by the military without a civilian trial, where is our Constitution? Where is the outrage at this fact? Because we're so scared of terrorists. I can't believe American people are this frightened of terrorism. I mean, if you studied the Cold War, you remember that communists were also in our backyard, and they were godless, and they were trying to destroy our way of life. So if you studied history, you know that war and terror is a part of history. You cannot overreact and destroy your Republican values in your Constitution, in your tradition, from fear.
Well, right, and yet it seems that fear is precisely what's dominating sort of the agenda here. Now, I want to play you a little clip of some of the Republican candidates for the White House, and I want you to sort of react and let me know what you think about the fear in this soundbite. Let's play that clip if we have it.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a president who isn't going to stop them. He isn't going to stop them from getting a nuclear weapon.
If you think a madman is about to have nuclear weapons, and you think that madman is going to use those nuclear weapons, then you have an absolute moral obligation to defend the lives of your people by eliminating the capacity to get nuclear weapons.
We must not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. If they do, the world changes, America will be at risk, and someday nuclear weaponry will be used. If I'm president...
Sean, you're talking about sort of educating the American people. One of these guys could be president of the United States. So what's your reaction?
Well, my reaction is we already have Obama as president. That's bad enough. What he's doing is a very dangerous game. He's not making a clear stand, even though his Joint Chief of Staff Dempsey and the military, I think, are very much opposed to the danger that Israel preemptively striking Iran. Obama has only stood by and said we are, unambiguously supporting Israel, and we're working hand in hand with them. This is not a clear message or a good message. We do not want to let Israel instigate something that can escalate into, as I said, a world war. I think Obama has to be much clearer in trying to, first of all, we're already at a war with Iran. We're at war with Iran. We're trying to destabilize them through sanctions. Mm-hmm. Now, an economic war, exactly. And the point is that you can't engage people diplomatically if you're already trying to isolate them. And what you're basically creating is more radicalism on their part, because you're trying to push them into a corner. And that was the test that they've been running, by, for example, killing their scientists in Tehran. This was an act of terrorism by Mossad and Mujahideen, as working hand in hand. In Tehran. If that had happened in America, for example, we'd have gone to war, I'm sure, right away.
And Sean, I mean, you just came back from Iran. A lot of the rhetoric here sort of paints the Iranians as these crazy people who might be a threat to America. Their leaders are crazy. I mean, that's what we're hearing from the media. How do Iranians see Americans? What is their perception of our leadership, given all this war talk?
Well, I would say if the Iranians think that, if people think the Iranians hate Americans, why would they let me come into their country and greet me so warmly? It's a misconception on our part to really believe that the Iranians hate the Americans. They have a loathing for imperialism, and this is historical. It goes back to the British and Russians. It goes back to the Shah, who was backed by Israeli and American regimes. And frankly, the Shah, his Savak, for example, his secret police were largely trained by Israelis and Americans. So there's a lot of antipathy to the regimes, the governments abroad because of that. But when it comes to the American people, I mean, I never once felt any kind of danger or threat from the Iranian people. Very sophisticated, very much like Americans. My first instinct, and I still believe this, is that Iranians, Israelis, and Americans will become good friends again, as they were historically, you know, until the overthrow of the Shah, and then the Iraq-Iran war, where, don't forget that Iraq was being sponsored, Saddam Hussein was being sponsored by the Americans against the Iranians.
Right.
So there was, you know, there was a lot of anger. This is a protracted 8-year conflict that killed many Iranians, and so the fact that they're still as calm as they are and sophisticated in this regard goes to show that we can deal with these people. I mean, I had great conversations with many politicians, including one of the top advisors to the Supreme Leader. These people are sophisticated, trained in the West, many of them trained in America or Western Europe, speaking English.
Now, Sean,
very cultured.
I don't want to interrupt you, but we're almost out of time, and so
I can have a dialogue.
You know, we're talking about dialogues here. We're talking about your experience there, and I want to bring in very briefly, before we run out of time, the role of the media coverage in all this, because you know a lot of the coverage that we're seeing here in the U.S. doesn't really reflect this view that Iran is a sane, sort of rational actor. And in fact, your trip got a very specific tinge in the media coverage. I want to play you a quick soundbite from your recent interviews on CNN and Fox.
Look, the one thing that he said that's undeniable was he said that the Holocaust never happened. And once you get into that kind of a fringe lunatic assessment, I don't care if he believes in the Holocaust. I don't want to see our country go to war.
When you met him, did you bring up this denial of the Holocaust that he keeps purporting? I mean, it seems very perverse that you would wish to spend much time with this guy, given your family upbringing.
You're dealing with a guy who is an extremist. He's a fanatic. And it would be like if you were in Germany in the 1930s and you were talking to Himmler.
So here you are trying to talk about the threat of war. They're talking about your relationship with Ahmadinejad. What does that say to you about the role of U.S. media?
Well, it's the role that the media played in the build to the Iraq War. I mean, my father's done a good job of trying to point this out in his documentaries, for example, on Chavez, on Castro, trying to get the other person's point of view across. Why can't, you know, rather than trying to vilify the guy, why don't you at least hear his point? That's the nature of dialogue, and that's the nature of diplomacy. But if we're trying to become an empire and act as an empire would in terms of forcing policies down a sovereign nation's throat, then this is exactly the trajectory that we're following. As far as the Holocaust, by the way, I mean, I'm not trying to say that in any way I agree with anyone who denies the Holocaust, but don't forget the Japanese still don't acknowledge their Holocaust to the Chinese and Southeast Asians from World War II, and they've been our great trading partner, you know, since we dropped the bomb, since '45. So the question is, you know, it's obviously not a question of principles and morals. There's an agenda here, you know, and the fact that they're trying to create a war with Iran, it helps that purpose by saying that Ahmadinejad is some mad dictator, which he is simply not. He doesn't even have that power in his country. And in terms of whatever he may or may not have said regarding Israel, I would love to see more of a dialogue opening up regarding Israel and the West Bank in any case, and Jerusalem specifically.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I wanted to thank you so much for your appearance here. And, you know, a lot of critical issues. We don't really see an honest discussion of the actual threats the U.S. faces in the media by our politicians. And, you know, sometimes it just takes folks from non-political lines of work, I guess, to call attention to all that. Thank you so very much. That was filmmaker Sean Stone.